Hello friends, I am Dr. Sandeep Prakash Joshi, Head of the Postgraduate University Department of English. I welcome you all to the virtual center from campus to college and community, virtual C4 channel, where we have organized for you a web lecture series on the theme of COVID-19 and related aspects. Friends, the COVID-19 pandemic has overtaken the world with overwhelming rapidity and force and has influenced millions of lives across the globe. It has created huge impact on the world economy and has affected lives in all sections of society, irrespective of race, religion, class, creed, gender, and sex. The assault has been so massive and so sudden that we have been caught unawares and unprepared and have found ourselves gasping for breath, quite literally. We have yet not fully come to terms with the nature and far reaching effects it has caused on our day to day life. It has given rise to grave concerns and consequences, even as we remain clueless regarding its impact on our future lives and careers. In such a scenario, where we have been rendered defenseless as there is no vaccine and efficacious medicine still available, only right information and knowledge alone can help us to cope up with the challenge and threat posed by this COVID-19 scourge. Hence, under the inspiration and encouragement of our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Dr. Murlidhar Sandekar, we have taken this initiative to enlighten the society through our channel where intellectuals and scholars from different fields share their knowledge and understanding and help us to prepare and brace ourselves against the ongoing onslaught of the coronavirus. So today we have as our distinguished guest, Dr. Prantik Banerjee, who would be enlightening us with his talk titled Unmasking the Crisis in Literature and Culture in the Time of Masks. But before I hand over the reins to him, I would briefly read out his brief introduction details about him. Dr. Prantik Banerjee is Associate Professor, Department of English, and former IQAC Coordinator, Hislop College, Nagpur. He is a published poet and short story writer. His poems have featured in Sahitya Academy's Indian Literature and various reputed journals like PEN, Brown Critic, Kavya Bharati, Journal of Poetry, Society of India, Little Magazine, etc. He has featured as Poet of the Fortnight in Femina by the renowned Indian poet Kamala Das. Indian Express ran a weekly column of his articles. Dr. Banerjee is a noted PhD supervisor and a member of the Board of English Studies at RTM Nagpur University. He has worked as an expert on the drafting committee of NCCI's higher education policy. He has also presented the triennial conference statement of AIACHE, Christ University, Bengaluru. He was also involved in the draft revision for the Kakodkar Committee report. He has served as the NAT expert and RUSA trainer and conducted many training programs for colleges and universities in India. His publications include one book, several book chapters, and numerous research articles in many illustrated national and international journals. His area of interest are cultural studies, film theory, post-colonial studies, trauma theory, and disability studies. He's also interested in higher education policies and quality assurance framework. So I welcome Dr. Banerjee and I invite him to deliver his talk. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Dr. Sandeep Joshi, for those wonderful words by way of introducing me. And personally, I am very grateful to Dr. Joshi for giving me this opportunity to be part of what I believe is a marvelous project that has been the initiative of Sant Gadge Baba Amravati University, and I think heartiest congratulations are due to the vision of the Honorable Vice Chancellor of the University, and all the and also Dr. Uh, Dr. Mona Chimote and Sandeep Joshi, who are the coordinator and the co-coordinator of this project. Uh, I believe that the lockdown and the COVID crisis and the lockdown that it has enforced has brought about a paradigm shift in the way in which we deliver our curriculum, in the way in which curricular transaction takes place, its procedures and processes. And in this context, I think the future of our teaching learning methods, it has not only undergoing, it is not only undergoing a radical transformation, but I think as we go along, even in the post-COVID times, as and when the situation returns to normalcy, uh, online teaching, online resources, remote access learning, these are going to be the game changers. These are going to be the features or the markers that will define the landscape of higher education. And therefore, in the context of these paradigm shift in higher education, I think it has been a very, very, as I said, visionary project that has been undertaken by Amravati University under the leadership of the Honorable Vice Chancellor, as well as the team, the team of coordinator and co-coordinators who are. Having said that, the topic that I plan to give my talk on is a topic I think is something that is related to all of us, related to what we are experiencing on a day-to-day basis. The title of my presentation, the title of my topic is Unmasking the Crisis in Literature and Culture in the Time of Mass. Let me share my presentation. Yeah. So friends, the subject of my talk, of my discourse is Unmasking the Crisis in Literature and Culture in the Time of Mass. And it was, it's quite in these days when we all are wearing masks both inside and outside our homes, I think it is quite an extraordinary experience, even though it is on a virtual platform, to see people, to see Sandeep sir, to see Chimote madam, and to see our technical support, Gaurav, without masks. We will all be, we will all, we will all be, we need to get accustomed, we need to get acclimatized and familiar with this kind of teaching. Friends, who would have thought that we would turn to Hamlet to best describe our present COVID crisis? The time is out of joint. But then, who else but Shakespeare, who wrote King Lear, Macbeth, and Antony and Cleopatra during the time of plague? And we all know from our knowledge of the history of the Elizabethan age that from the end of the 15th to the mid 16th century, England and Europe witnessed the scourge of not one but three bubonic plagues, what in the history of literature is known as the Black Death. Truly, the ongoing pandemic crisis has become a life-altering event. It is causing, or it has already caused, like I said, a paradigm shift in the way we think of literature, the way we think of culture, and the way we are living our lives itself. The COVID-19 crisis is already being called the defining moment of the millennium by literary and cultural theorists like Judith Butler and Slavoj Zizek. In fact, Judith Butler connects the present pandemic crisis to her theory of precarity, which she had formulated in a book that came out a couple of years back on precariousness and precarity. And Zizek, uh, you know, treats the disease not just as a medical, not just as a social and economic malaise, but as an intellectual malaise from which we will only be rescued by what he calls a philosophical and social revolution. In fact, among the many books that we as teachers and lovers of literature probably would have read during the lockdown, one of the first cultural theorists and social commentators to be, the first off the blocks to publish something was Slavoj Zizek, who brought out a book called, not surprisingly, Pandemic Panic. And therefore, it is in this book that he speculates and conjectures about the manner in which the pandemic or the COVID-19 crisis is a crisis, it is an existential crisis, it is a metaphysical crisis, and therefore which requires a shift in the way in which not only global politics is played out, but the way in which we structure our society, the way in which we pattern our lives and our thoughts and our belief systems. And therefore, he emphasizes that this contagious disease can only be, we can only recover from this contagious disease by what he calls a philosophical and social revolution. Among the many prominent writers also that we as teachers and lovers of literature we've been following during the lockdown is, for example, Arundhati Roy. And Arundhati Roy, in an essay that came out in an e-print, in an electronic version online, this essay was titled "The Pandemic is a Portal." Can I have the slide, please? Yeah. So this is a quote that I found very interesting, which actually sums up, which is an apt précis of the entire social, emotional, and psychological experience that we are witnessing and experiencing in the time of lockdown. And Arundhati Roy, in her own inimitable style, captures the essence of her experience, and I'll read out to you. She says in this article called "The Pandemic is a Portal," she says, "Who can use the term gone viral now without shuddering a little? Who can look at anything anymore, a door handle, a cardboard carton, and a bag of vegetables, without imagining it swarming with those unseeable, undead, unliving blobs dotted with suction pads waiting to fasten themselves onto our lungs?" It is one of the strangest ironies and paradoxes of human experience that a COVID-19 virus, which is spreading not just the disease, but so much of fear, psychosis, and social disorder, should be attached to the honorific, to an adjective, which is what we call the novel COVID-19 or the corona or the novel corona COVID-19 virus. Truly, this is a novel. I mean, not only is this pathogen a novel, and by that we have understood as something unique, but it has also caused a singular alteration, a singular transformation in our social reality. Uh, if you ask me what exactly has the COVID pandemic done, in what ways has the COVID pandemic impacted on our political, social, and everyday lives? Well, I would say that the COVID pandemic has created what I term a culture of pandemonium. A culture of pandemonium is a culture of chaotic change and disorder. It is it is a culture of chaotic change and disorder that I feel is brought about by a cataclysmic event. And by cataclysmic event, I mean those those events which could either be man-made or natural. Those disasters that are either man-made or natural, and that of course includes the things like earthquakes, things like famine, pestilence, and of course now the epidemic. I mean, just look at why I say that the COVID pandemic crisis is a culture of pandemonium. Is look at the way in which the pandemic is threatening to break our society apart. I mean, we have been following the news and we have been experiencing it personally. And we see, for example, thousands of people dying of the virus, a struggling medical support system, a crumbling economy, and a disintegrating social order. Some experts have suggested that we are experiencing not one, but two disasters. There is the virus, and then there is the collapse of our social, fiscal, and economic systems due to the lockdown. Personally, it appears to me that there is a third disaster that is being engendered by the pandemic. That is, as I said, a disaster that I said is a culture of pandemonium. And the culture of pandemonium is signified by certain characteristics, by certain markers, which are extremely disturbing, which are exposing the fault lines in our society. So, what do I really mean when I say that the pandemic has inaugurated a culture of pandemonium? As the slide shows to you, that border sealing and border surveillance. For example, what we have witnessed since March 2020 is that with the spread of the disease, there has been an increase, there has been an intensified effort on the part of countries and nations in order to scale up their borders, in order to bar the entry of travelers and immigrants, and also perhaps as in India, we are witnessing the states, the borders of the states. So there has been there has been an amplification in the way in which nations, states, and countries have been forced to scale up borders and increase the amount of surveillance, security checks, and of incoming and outgoing travelers has become the new normal. Racial and community profiling. This is something that I would be touching perhaps at a later part of my talk. But yes, racial and community profiling has been another characteristic and a disturbing characteristic that has completely transformed our social reality. The way in which we have been labeling certain races and certain communities as and holding them responsible for being the carriers and the vectors of the disease is an unfortunate part, and that we see in our personal lives itself, how thousands, lakhs and lakhs of migrant laborers who are making what I call the Great Indian Migration. 60 lakh people. It has been reported that estimates are that 60 lakh people in the last couple of months, in fact, in India have been struggling to reach home. And this is one of the largest migrations that has taken place in Indian history outside of wars and even partition. So the culture of pandemonium really has brought about some disturbing social and cultural characteristics that has exposed our systems and our structures, including our governance, exposed the fault lines in it. Xenophobia, well, border sealing and border surveillance has been the direct result of a feeling of fear, a feeling of menace of the outsider. So the migrant has become the outsider. The immigrant in traveling across international borders has become the outsider. And what it has generally created, the pandemic has generally created, is that it has created a fear psychosis, which I call it pathologies of fear. It has created also new geographies of disease. Friends, uh, I mean, undoubtedly, there is the global disaster that we are witnessing is a worldwide medical crisis. It is a health emergency. It is a pandemic catastrophe. Uh, but there is more to the pandemic than meets the eye. Undoubtedly, the pandemic is threatening to decimate people. It is bankrupting economies and derailing social lives. But at the same time, it is making us acutely aware of how border controls, sanitation regimes, and quarantine measures are actually enmeshed both in the pathways of the disease as well as in the processes of globalization. Or until recently, until the beginning of the outbreak, globalization seemed to be a triumphant worldwide game changer, and with its transnational, with the ease with which technologies of communication and technologies of transport made all of us connected in ways that we would never have imagined. So when we talked about globalization and how the processes of globalization has made our world a global village, it was basically a celebration of the economic, the social, as well as the political formulations of globalization. But, and this is the paradox of globalization that we are witnessing. On the one hand, globalization has facilitated, has interconnected all of us in ways that we could never have imagined. Our ways of connection, I mean, today's web talk, for example, is one of the positive elements of globalization. But at the same time, given the COVID crisis, globalization is also exposing some of the negative attributes, that it's not always good to be connected, because connections, when I say it's not good to be connected all the time, it also shows that connections across borders, connections across digital platforms, connections across people also has facilitated the transmission of diseases. So, globalization as a phenomena has much to be celebrated about, but it has also, in a very ironical way, it has exposed us to the threat and the transmission of deadly diseases, of deadly viruses. So the containment, or rather the contagion, may have it has a medical origin, but it clearly has unleashed a set of disturbing cultural parameters. And these are some of the disturbing parameters that I have outlined in the slide. Racial and communal profiling, for example, of patients or of disease, or of carriers of disease, a new geography of disease. When I say new geographies of disease, look at the way in which we have become familiar with the changing landscape around us, our neighborhoods, our cities. So the point here that I'm trying to make is that, that the contagion, of course, has a medical origin, but it has created certain, let me go back to the previous slide. Yeah. I was talking about the new geographies of disease. And with reference to this term that I have coined, new geographies of disease, what I mean to say is, look at the way in which our localities, our neighborhoods, our cities and streets are being color coded, orange, orange, green, the hotspots, and the color coded. It is completely changing the landscape. And this is what the COVID-19 crisis has done, that it has mapped, it is mapping its transmission of its deadly virus by color coding and changing our new topography. And that is what I mean by the new geographies of disease. Uh, the What is of interest to me is that since the very topic is unmasking the crisis in literature and culture. What is interesting to me about the COVID crisis is that how will writers, for example, respond to a crisis that is said to be unimaginable and incomprehensible? What kind of writings will it produce? What will be the place for such literature in the larger narratives of culture, politics, and society? In what way, for example, will the literature of fiction, poetry, and essay differ from the rhetoric and the media narratives that we are following? What about truth claims? Will the literature of pandemic offer any counter narratives to these grand narratives of globalization and postmodernity? In short, the central question that I'm trying to engage and address in my talk is that will writing in the time of COVID crisis enable us to know better not only the nature of pathogens, but also our own nature, our own society? Friends, I'll map my talk by unpacking my thoughts along three axes of discourse. First, how will the pandemic impact on culture? Second, how will the pandemic impact on writers and writing? And third, what will be the nature of these new writings that will emerge after the COVID crisis, after we are through with the COVID crisis? So let me take each one of these axes one by one. The first question, let me elaborate and explain my points on the first axis, and how will the pandemic impact culture? Well, I've already suggested that that today's pandemic has produced, as I said, a culture of pandemonium. It has instilled in us a fear psychosis that is already making anxiety, suspicion, and paranoia the new normal. I mean, look at the way in which we are witnessing this altered social reality on a day-to-day basis. Stepping out of our houses itself requires such an elaborate preparation, with masks and sanitizers. Coming back from our workplaces or coming back from a kirana store after shopping, after buying our essentials. Well, shopping in malls is a faraway thought. But even coming from from the kirana shop or buying milk, for example, from a vendor, everywhere we are stricken by a fear that, are we going to get infected? Are we going to fall sick? The COVID crisis really, as I said, one of the indicators of a pandemonium, of a culture of pandemonium, is this new social reality where the abnormal has become the normal. What the COVID crisis has also done is that it has accelerated the process of othering, of stigmatizing certain groups of people by their class, by their profession, by their religion, and by their race. Remember, when the first cases were being reported from China, how the American president Donald Trump, for example, referred in many of his press interactions. He referred to this as yellow peril, and he also referred to the virus as the Chinese virus. So, among the many things that are the negative attributes that are changing, that are becoming part of our social reality, is also the fact that stigmatization of people and places is something that is happening. Um so, uh, is the pandemic therefore a cultural trauma? I mean, of course, it is a medical trauma, it is a health crisis, but then the manner in which it is changing our views, manner in which it is changing human behavior, and the way in which we look at people, the way in which we are interacting with people, has the pandemic brought about a cultural trauma? Well, the answer is that it is a cultural trauma, that the COVID-19 has introduced a cultural trauma because it has produced an environment which is steeped in what culture theorists like Kathy Karuth and Shoshana Feldman would call cultural trauma. And I borrow the word cultural trauma from specifically from the manner in which these theorists have outlined what they mean by cultural trauma. And if you look at the characteristics that have been underlined by these theorists, namely the ones that are displayed on the screen, cultural trauma, according to Kathy Karuth and Soshna Feldman, is something that produces a physical and mental injury, and often it is caused by historical events. And I was just a couple of minutes back, I was talking about how the culture of pandemonium is a culture that produces chaos through disasters, whether it is natural or whether it is man-made. So historical events, when Karuth and Feldman talk about historical events being responsible for cultural trauma, then clearly they are referring to those incidents, to those events, like I said, earthquakes, world wars, famine, pestilence, all of which have had an enormous world-altering consequence. The theorists, the trauma theorists like Karuth and Feldman also suggest that post-traumatic stress disorder is something that is always has a delayed reaction. It does not come immediately. It does not come in the immediacy of an injury or of a great psychological stress. It comes over a period of time. And therefore, while our initial response and reaction to the COVID crisis may have been one of extreme panic and anxiety, yet the larger impact on our experiences as well as on the memory of the trauma itself will be a delayed reaction. What it does, according to Karuth and Feldman, also is that cultural trauma signals the breakdown of all systems of signification. For example, the way in which the COVID crisis has transformed, has altered the very language which is perhaps the most important, the most important feature of our culture as human beings, because language is predominantly is what characterizes us as human beings. It is the predominant means of human communication, and how this language suddenly, the vocabulary of this language suddenly seems inadequate and ill-equipped to capture a reality which is becoming fractured, and a social reality that has become completely disrupted. And finally, uh, uh, cultural trauma is defined predominantly by an environment which is ridden by fear, anxiety, and depression. Basically, the manner in which cultural trauma has created an environment is one that I call pathologies of fear. And by pathologies of fear, I mean, it is a fear that causes significant and perceptible changes in social behavior and interaction. Like I said, stigmatization of people, profiling of certain communities and groups of people as carriers of the disease, and also treating migrant workers and even our domestic servants at our place, domestic help, for example, at our place as untouchables. So this is the kind of the consequences or the outcome, which I call pathologies of fear. Uh, uh, the pathology of fear is something that perhaps I refer to a book which came out nearly 50 years back, which was called Future Shock by a social scientist and a futurist named Alvin Toffler. Many of us would be familiar about Toffler's three waves. But in this particular book called Future Shock, published in 1970, Toffler defined future shock as a certain psychological state of individuals and societies caused by what he defined future shock as. According to him, future shock is when too much change takes place in too short a period of time. When too much change takes place in too short a period of time. Friends, I believe that this is perhaps the way in which Toffler has defined the term future shock is something that is applicable to us, because all of a sudden, in the course of just 3 months, everything around us seems to have changed, seems to have altered, and it also seems to suggest a future where we can never go back, we can never return to the state and the condition that we were familiar with. In the beginning of, before I began my talk, in an informal chat with Dr. Joshi, we were discussing the way in which the scenario of higher education itself is changing. And webinars and online classes that are taking place these days is symptomatic of what I call a future shock, when we were not even ready for this transformation, this radically altered world reality, and yet we are finding ourselves thrown at the deep end of hot waters in order to equip ourselves to meet this challenge posed by the COVID-19. Well, returning to Toffler's future shock, I mean, his prediction was that people in a post-industrial society would suffer from, as I said, shattering stress and disorientation, precisely the symptoms that the disease is causing in us. But of course, in Toffler's definition of future shock, he was the causative agents, the agents of causing this trauma or this shock, where was industrial technology and information overload. But the future shock that has now become present, Toffler's future shock that has now become the present, the moment for us, is because of a pandemic outbreak. And so COVID-19, in fact, crisis has fast forwarded the shock. Toffler's post-industrial future shock has become a post-globalization present shock. So, to enumerate what I have covered so far in my talk, the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic has created, as I said, a culture of pandemonium. It has created geographies of disease. It has created or produced a culture of trauma. It has given birth to pathologies of fear, and it has made Toffler's future shock something that is not only imminent, but something that we are experiencing in the present. As the title of my talk is Unmasking the Crisis of the Pandemic in the Time of Mass, what exactly is the nature of the crisis? I've highlighted already some of the features of this crisis, but then the larger question that we require as teachers and lovers of literature, that we require to engage and address is, can we create art in the time of pandemic atrocity? I mean, we all know how complex the process is for art to capture and make meaning of events that are horrific and far-flung in their repercussions. Um, it was, just give me a minute. Yeah. It was Theodore Adorno who said that to write poetry after Auschwitz would be barbaric. Of course, I mean, Adorno, the great Austrian social scientist, it was and thinker. It was Adorno also who before he died in 1969, retracted this remark, shown on my slide, the remark where he said to write poetry after Auschwitz would be barbaric. And he modified his remark just before his death to say that suffering has as much right to be represented as a martyr has to cry out. So it may have been false to say that writing poetry after Auschwitz is impossible. Now, the question really we are asking ourselves is, does art or can we produce art in the time of extreme trauma, in the time of extreme distress? And interesting, what I find interesting is that Adorno's substitution of the word barbaric with the word impossible, he is hinting, he's probably pointing out that the danger of crisis lies not in writing about the crisis, but in the pretense of understanding it. By that I mean to recreate a human tragedy in word, paint, or image is to expose the artist to the charge of inhuman appropriation. This alone can do injustice to the victims. So a similar debate has risen in today's times of COVID. Can we make art in a time of microbiological atrocity? Can the literary imagination capture the pain and the suffering of dying people or the survivors of the pandemic? Can art in general and literature in particular capture that which is being called as incomprehensible and unimaginable? Uh, you know, no one wants the trauma of pandemic to be misrepresented, to be politicized, to be co-opted, or to be distorted. But to place literature within the political and cultural context of a pandemic crisis is therefore to examine the relationship between ethics, and aesthetics. So how will writers respond and react to this crisis? Well, let, let's take the first, let's take this question in a general sense. How do writers respond to atrocity? Well, writers and artists throughout the ages have responded to atrocity in different and sometimes opposite ways. And I'll give you two examples. Uh, the example on your slide is is that of Claude Lanzmann, the very famous French director, uh, who produced this 9-hour documentary, very famous documentary named Shoah, which is basically a documentary on the atrocity of the Holocaust. Uh, it is a documentary which Lanzmann made over a period of 11 years, uh, which which carries more than 370 hours of footage in the form of interviews with the survivors of the Holocaust, their families and their friends, as well as witnesses of both victims. It carries interviews and footage of not only the experiences of the Holocaust by the victims, but also of the perpetrators of crimes. And Lanzmann took 11 years to make this 8-hour famous documentary. But he refused to use a single frame of archival footage and conducted his own interviews, as I said, with the survivors of concentration camps. So one can understand, therefore, that the length of time, 11 years it took him to make and complete the documentaries. The reason behind it was that he had to search and track down witnesses and survivors of the Holocaust in order to, and not rely on previous documented or previous films and previous visual documentaries. So not a single frame in this documentary produced by him relied on the archival records of the Holocaust. And the reason why I give you this example is that here is this world famous director in whose whose purpose in making this documentary was to was based on this belief, this unshakable belief of refusing to understand the Holocaust. Because after all, Lanzmann, in many an interview, said that the Holocaust itself was an event beyond human understanding, and therefore he said that he followed right through these 11 years that took him to produce this documentary. There was only one iron law. He called it iron law that he followed, and which he said was he rigorously adhered, was that the refusal to what he called the impossibility of understanding the trauma of the Jews. Because to try and even claim that one understands the trauma of the Jews, the enormous suffering and misery that the Jews had suffered at the hands of the Nazis, was what he called the absolute obscenity in the very project of understanding. So this is how artists respond to atrocities in different ways. And just to give you a contrasting example of the different positions that writers and artists take in their response to an atrocity, is this example of the very famous American writer, feminist, and film producer Susan Sontag. In, in July 1993, at the height of another atrocity that was taking place, and I'm referring to the Serbian-Bosnian War. Sontag wanted to stage a production of Waiting for Godot in the city of Sarajevo, which was then a city which was besieged by the Serbian militia. Today, when we remember, when we remember, or when we read about the accounts of one of the bloodiest wars, ethnic conflicts that took place in the Serbian-Bosnian frontier. Sarajevo itself was a city which witnessed the longest siege in human history and in recorded history, and one also which was rare in the use of brutal force and violence, extreme violence. And so during the Bosnian Serbian war, one of the tragedy was of innocent people being caught in the fray of rabid nationalism and ethnic politics, and it was and Susan Sontag wanted to bring to the embattled city of Sarajevo a production of her production of Waiting for Godot. And it was around this time that Sontag faced a lot of criticism, not only by a certain section of the media, but as well as by some of her fellow writers. They both people, a certain section of the media as well as fellow writers, felt that she was displaying, in her insistence to bring to Sarajevo a drama, a play. She was showing a very cavalier approach to do a play for people who were just trying to save their lives at a time when people were busy just trying to stay alive. But Sontag refused to back down, and in fact went on to do not one but multiple shows in the bloody zone. Now, which incidentally was very, I mean, her production of the plays, the multiple performances were enthusiastically received by the locals. So Sontag, when she was asked by reporters why she was so adamant, in bringing the play to an embattled city, she said that she considered herself to belong to a tradition of writers like George Orwell and Ernest Hemingway, who threw themselves where the action was. And I quote from Sontag that when she said that people told me I was crazy to come here to Sarajevo, but they didn't understand that I couldn't not come here. Once I understood what was happening, it was the obvious moral choice. It was the only choice. Friends, to come back to the question, how will the pandemic impact writers and writing? And this is the second axis that I was talking about. The second axis around which my discourse revolves. When a traumatic event with world-altering consequences happens, not only does it alter the reality of our times, but it also makes demands on language. And language, because language has to be stretched to accommodate a new reality. New words, neologisms have to be coined to reflect a new condition. For instance, the COVID pandemic itself has already created a new social lexicon. Look at the way in which words that we were unfamiliar with just a couple of months back are now part of our everyday conversations. Words like super spreader, patient zero, lockdown, social distancing, community spread, quarantine, comorbidity, flattening of the curve. I mean, all these, these words that we thought belonged to the specialized discipline of medicine and health sciences has now become part and parcel of our own vocabulary. So the language, the very language that the pandemic has produced a new language because it is only through a new idiom and a new vocabulary that a new social reality can be captured. Sontag, the other thing that I was reminded when I was researching for this talk is that of having read a book that again came out 30, 40 years back, not one, but in fact two books. One was Sontag's Illness as a Metaphor, and then the third, and a sequel to that in the 80s, Illness as a Metaphor probably was written in the 60s. And in the 80s, she wrote another book, AIDS as Metaphor. Both these books, for example, I found them pertinent to our discussion here today about the crisis created by the COVID-19 virus, because both books are about the impact of a disease on human beings, on social relations. In the first book, Illness as a Metaphor, Sontag is talking about cancer and cancer victims, and in the second, the sequel, of course, she's talking about AIDS, people infected with the deadly AIDS that became such a terrible contagion in the 80s, both in Africa as well as the United States. So what holds my interest with these two books is that that Sontag seems to be making a case. Her argument is common. It's a common argument to both these books, is that like the cancer patients and AIDS victims, social stigmatizing is something that she focuses on, and something she relates that the very process of classifying and classifying a disease as an epidemic, as a contagious disease. And the very protocols of treating a disease is not just a health, is not just a part of the health and biomedicine regime, but it also alters our our social behavior with people. Cancer patients, for example, were treated as outcasts. In a similar way, people infected with the dreaded AIDS disease were also treated as outcasts, as untouchables. They were ostracized and separated from the mainstream of society. And something similar is what we are witnessing today in the manner in which not only are we treating positive cases of the coronavirus as something as a social, as a social stigma, and so much so that even the metaphors, and this is what Sontag highlights in both the books, the metaphors and the myths that we use the military metaphors that we have been using to describe what we call, to describe our doctors and health professionals who are fighting and battling. The word fighting and battling, it is almost like a war. So the military metaphors that are being employed in our conversations, in our narratives to deal with this crisis, according to Sontag, it does not remove, but adds to the social stigma of the patients and the sufferers. And therefore, she believes, her argument in both these books is that the effective way to treat and face a deadly contagious disease is to remove out of our conversations, to remove out of our social, private and political social discourses metaphors. To treat a disease and talk about it in terms of metaphors is to aggravate the condition. It is to aggravate the suffering and the misery of the victims and the sufferers. So the question therefore is that if the COVID-19 crisis has produced a new language, if with words like, as I said, community spread, super spreaders, patient zero, well, these words themselves, according Sontag might agree, have already become inflected. They have become contaminated by what we call social stigma, something that she was pointing out in these two books. Well, as I said, how will this cultural trauma, how will the pandemic impact writers and writing? It is my opinion like the trauma of world wars, like the trauma of partition, like the trauma of any major historical event, the trauma of the pandemic must be and will be narrativized and historicized. Because as the French psychiatrist Pierre Janet said, the traumatic memory must be turned into a narrative memory. If trauma is the collapse of the network of signification, then a new narrative is needed to restore the broken link. So in a time of the COVID virus, when, as the media said, we all may be COVIDs, the pandemic has become a rupture for everybody. And as a consequence, there is a globalized need to comprehend, to explore, and to explain and to restore. And it is here that literature has an important and a very significant role to play, because it is through art and literature, it is art and literature that can clarify our understanding, that can appeal to our finer sensibilities and evoke love, compassion, and empathy, the things that we need to keep our very humanity alive facing this deadly challenge. So to return to this argument, let me return to this argument that to write poetry or fiction on trauma, on traumatic events, reduces the irreducible to the familiar. I mean, it is to argue that one cannot or should not write about other people's extreme suffering. And this, I think, is a rather weak case. Because it seems to me that the question that we are asking is, are we saying that writers can write about traumatic events only if they invent a language which is authentic, which is legitimate, or which is even truthful to the event? I mean, once again, the word truthful, as we understand, in times, in post-truth times, truth, the word authentic, and the word real, all of these have become very loaded terms. They have several connotations, and therefore, truth itself is a prism because it refracts and reflects many points of view and many perspectives, and therefore there is no single absolute experience of truth. And if this be so, then those who argue that one should not write about the traumatic experience unless one is able to invent a language that is adequate, a language that is appropriate. I personally feel this is a line of thinking. It's a kind of a solipsism that traps both the trauma victims as well as the trauma narrator into a deadlock of neurosis and depression. I mean, after all, the function and purpose of art is to help us. It has a cathartic function, and it is to enable us to cope. To one of the first books, the first books that I read during the lockdown, and I returned to a book that I had read many years back, and this is Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl, as many of you would know, Holocaust survivor, and his best known work is this Man's Search for Meaning, which is more like a psychological memoir. The book is a profound and deep meditation on the gruesome experience of the horrors of concentration camps. And it is a personal search. In the book is personal search for meaning produced by extreme trauma. The book itself, although was a personal experience, came out of personal experience, and it is a personal testimony of the Holocaust, yet the book gave hope and solace to thousands of Holocaust survivors and the families of victims. Years, years after the success of the book had made Viktor Frankl an acclaimed writer, he said to an interviewer, and I quote, "In the first place," he said, "I do not at all see in the bestseller status of my book an achievement, an accomplishment on my part, but rather an expression of the misery of our time. If hundreds of thousands of people reach out for a book whose very title promises to deal with the question of a meaning to life, it must be a question that burns under their fingernails." Friends, literature written about trauma always provides answers to questions that Frankl calls questions that burn under our fingernails. Because this is the meta-narrative function of literature. This is the noble and ideal purpose by which we take literature to be, its ultimate purpose. Because in the midst of confusion and chaos, the culture of pandemonium that I defined earlier, when people are waging a daily battle against an invisible and dangerous pathogen, it is art and literature that gives us hope. It is art and literature that gives us courage, and it is art and literature that gives us calm. Therefore, for art to avoid taking the risk of narrating what is simply thought to be unspeakable is to canonize silence. And so the danger is of idealizing trauma as something untouchable, because when we do it, it makes the real pain and the real suffering transcendent. And in the process, the event that caused the trauma in the first place is removed from history. It dehistoricizes the event. It is only through language and in language that can there be an unspeakable. So what will be, I come to the third and final, final point of my discussion today. What may be the new writings to emerge out of the pandemic crisis? Well, it is said that the world will change after COVID-19. It is also being said that literature will change, that in a couple of decades from now, people will talk about pre-COVID and post-COVID literature. Uh, you know, that writers will react to the defining moment of the century so far. And so both established as well as new writers will use the pandemic either to construct as the central event of this story or to use it as a backdrop. After all, history bears witness to the fact that great crisis has always produced great literature. I mean, think of the books that has come out of epidemics in the past. Boccaccio's Decameron, Mary Shelley's The Last Man, Catherine Ann Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, or Camus' The Plague. Um, those of us who keep ourselves abreast with what writers are doing in COVID times, well, or even before the COVID, Orhan Pamuk, the Nobel Prize winner, writer, a Turkish writer, is currently writing a historical novel set in 1901 during what is known as the Third Plague Pandemic, a story about a time of the outbreak of a bubonic plague that killed millions of people in Asia. And newspaper media reports suggest that he has already as Knights of Plague. So, the COVID crisis will bring a lot of literature, but I would like to speculate on what will be the nature of this kind of writing. Well, my guess is that new writings in fiction may prominently belong to the following genres, to the following kinds of writings that I've displayed, that I've pointed out in the slide. New writings could be in the nature of speculative fiction, and by speculative fiction, well, there would be a lot of fiction, a lot of stories and novels that we could categorize as post-apocalyptic or dystopian novels. Probably, such novels might come out with titles such as The End of the World or The World According to COVID. Personal memoirs and life writing, is also something that is going to come out very soon. And already, why very soon? Well, already one ebook that is making a lot of that is attracting a lot of attention is by this famous Chinese writer named Fang Fang. And he's already written, she's written a book called the Wuhan Diary, which actually gives an account of the experiences she had faced during the lockdown in China. So such kind of testimonial or life writings or daily or diaries on the COVID crisis are going to come out. Then, of course, testimonial narratives, including period novels, like maybe with titles such as Hard Times and Bleak House. Of course, the references to Dickens and Dickens's novels. So and here is my here is my guess or my speculation, and that is that the pandemic may also inspire new writings from the media that may blur the boundaries between different kinds of literary writings. And I'm thinking here of Daniel Defoe's, for example, Journal of the Plague Years in London, which he wrote in the 1960s. Then Ernest Hemingway's War Dispatches during the Spanish Civil War, or for that matter, Norman Mailer's The Armies of the Night, his book called The Armies of the Night, which covered the 1965 anti-Vietnam war rally. And these are all classic examples of works that fictionalize history. And Norman Mailer's work, along with Truman Capote's Cold Blood. I mean, these today when we read and study new kinds of writings, or rather writings that have given birth to a new form. Well, Mailer and Truman Capote were the ones who inaugurated a new style of writing, combining journalistic reporting with fictional narration, and they called it faction. Faction, that is, facts in the form of fiction. So, well, who knows that today's newspaper columns and reports like Hemingway's War Dispatches may inspire novels such as Farewell to Arms or For Whom the Bell Tolls. Um, uh, I think it was till at least a decade after they occur. So, the greatest or the best novel on the COVID pandemic, I imagine it will take a long time before someone writes it. We don't know what it will look like. It could be, the love in the time of cholera of the 21st century, or maybe a new 100 years of solitude or social distancing. Uh, the point I'm trying to make here is that, we remember Joseph Heller, for example, wrote Catch 22 almost 25 years after Pearl Harbor. And War and Peace wasn't finished until 50 years after France's invasion of Russia. And I think the jury may still be out on who wrote the definitive work on the Vietnam War. The point I'm making here is I'm bringing these examples in order to understand the relationship between temporality and traumatic representation. And that is, how much time has to elapse before one can take enough critical and meditative distance to write about catastrophic events. Because after all, in an age of first-hand accounts, social media, and 24-hour news coverage, the question is, what imaginative leap can an author take with an event such as the COVID crisis, an event of great social and cultural upheaval? Well, literature written about and after COVID-19 may appear as a sequence of genres. That is, shorter forms are likely to appear first: poetry, essays, and personal reminiscences. It will take several years longer for novels and full-length memoirs to appear. And therefore, like war literature, the early works may attempt to directly capture and convey the events of the pandemic. But as time passes, I feel that the approach to the pandemic will become more nuanced. And as is often the case, when literature responds to a calamity, writers will experiment with their craft. They will introduce formal innovations in their narratives. So, self reflexive meta narratives, disrupted temporality, multiple viewpoints, and these and many more will be adopted by writers to deal with the challenge of writing about the COVID. Are writers in any crisis? Uh, well, April has been the cruelest month for writers. And major publishing houses like Random House, Little Brown, Penguin, all of these have put on indefinite hold all writerly events, book launches, promotion events, award ceremonies, lectures, and workshops of writers have been cancelled. It looks as if writing as a livelihood has been seriously jeopardized. Bad news for new writers, but I think this is just a temporary phase. But certainly, the trends. For example, the online retail giant Amazon has already deprioritized book sales worldwide in order to meet the demands for essential commodities and medical supplies. And in this scenario, in this crisis scenario, if writers are afraid of not being, are fearful of not being able to pay their rents and taxes and insurances, how will they ever return to their half-finished manuscripts or the novels that they were planning to write? So indeed, even though if it is for the time being, the diversity of books and culture seems to me, at least for the present moment, in real danger because of the domino effect of the COVID crisis. Friends, the lockdown has made us all wonder about the future of literature, about the future of culture, and about the future of our own lives. It has made us look after, and it has made us look before and after, and pine for what is not. Hopefully, what will emerge out of the crucible of the COVID crisis will be writings that will not only match the best of war or trauma fiction of the past, but fiction that will inspire and bring out the best in our shared humanity. Years from now, maybe we will be telling our children and our grandchildren it was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. So, thank you so much. Thank you once again, Dr. Sandeep Joshi and Dr. Mona Chimote and the support team for giving me this opportunity to deliver a webinar talk and more importantly, hopefully, to add to this wonderful consortium of educational resources that is being planned by Amravati University. So once again, kudos to the Honorable Vice Chancellor, to his vision, as well as all the members who are involved in this wonderful project. Thank you once again.
Dr. Prantik sir, it was really a very wonderful lecture. You have covered so many points, really pertinent points, and great sentences have remained interspersed uh, throughout the lecture. One beautiful sentence was, great crises have always produced great literature, and hopefully new and great literature will come. Of course, you have mentioned that it may take long period or a long time for a really good piece of writing that would cover all the important aspects. And you have also mentioned that the boundaries, literary boundaries, may emerge as blur. So these are the things that really remains a challenge for the new writers, the new writing, and hopefully literature will emerge triumphant from this crisis. I am thankful to Dr. Prantik Banerjee for such a wonderful lecture, illuminating lecture, and on behalf of the virtual C4 team and the technical team and the audience, I thank you all for making this session a success. Thank you.